We've had a lot of questions come in lately about what's going on with the Section 8 program and the other low income housing programs that so many of you rely on. So, today we want to dive in and go over those changes with you today. As you probably already know, the Trump administration has proposed many massive sweeping cuts to Section 8, and a lot of these would put radical reforms on how the program operates. This has created a lot of uncertainty in the Section 8 program. I've seen some public housing authorities that have stopped issuing new vouchers because they don't know what's going on, while others are continuing to accept people onto their wait list, even though they know that the funding may not be available for those vouchers in the future. So, today I want to go over what the original proposals were, what the current status is regarding those proposals, and what you can expect to see going forward. So let's start off with what was originally proposed. So, in the White House's 2026 wish list of things, they wanted to cut the budget for federal housing assistance by approximately 43%, which is a very significant cut. They also wanted to change the way the entire program works by consolidating the five biggest housing assistance programs into a single block grant. And those housing programs that would be affected include things like not only Section 8 housing choice vouchers, but Section 202, which is housing support for the elderly. They also were going to include the housing support for people with disabilities and some of those other major programs that exist to offer that support. They were just basically going to consolidate all of the money from all of those programs into a single grant and then give that money to the states and say, here's your housing, help figure it out, instead of earmarking each one of those budgets individually for those specific needs. Now, along with that, they also want to introduce new work requirements and new 2-year time limits for households that do not have at least one elderly or disabled person in them. So, those 2-year time limits would put housing support at risk for those 3 million people because 2 years is not a lot of time. Now, along with that, they also want to eliminate some programs, including the home investment partnerships that help build more housing and the community development block grants, which historically we've reported on those. Usually they're tied to things like home repair grants and things like that, extra sources of housing support that aren't necessarily, Section 8 vouchers. Along with that, they also wanted to cut other homeless assistance and fair housing programs as well. There were a lot of cuts outlined in that proposal, as you can tell by the fact that they wanted to reduce the budget by 43%, which is huge. Now, bear in mind, that's what the White House asked for in their so called skinny budget. But the federal government is made up of all sorts of different layers and committees and subcommittees. And there's a huge, long procedural chain of events that has to happen before something like that can be enacted into law and those changes can actually be finalized and made. So, what's happening now is we're starting to see these specific policy changes moving forward through the system in pretty small levels at this point. So, inside of Congress, you have the Senate and the House of Representatives. Inside the House of Representatives, you have a committee on appropriations. Inside that committee, you have a lot of different subcommittees. And the Subcommittee on Transportation and Housing and Urban Development, acronym of THUD, released their spending bill on July 13th. And the Committee on Appropriations approved that on July 21st. And now the full Senate Appropriations Committee is expected to consider that draft bill today. So at that point, it'll either pass that committee or they'll mark it up, make changes, whatever. But it's still in that committee. And then after that committee, it has to go to the House and then the Senate and so on and so forth. So there's still a lot of progress that has to be made in finalizing those changes. That being said, the subcommittee that worked on this bill made a lot of changes on what the original proposal was. So we're already seeing a lot of different ideas being pushed around. And I think you're going to find some of this really interesting. Honestly, it was a relief to see what came out of that committee. So the new bill that they have passed through the subcommittee would fund HUD at $67.8 billion, which is a decrease over what we've seen in this current fiscal year, but it's not as sharp of a decrease as they originally asked for. When Secretary Turner from HUD went into the hearing at this subcommittee, he asked them to slash the budget by 43%. And the committee turned around and said, you know what, we're going to cut it, but we're not going to cut it by that much. So this is actually a tremendous relief that it wasn't worse. It's still worse than it was this year, but it's not nearly as bad as it could have been. One important thing to note here is that they completely rejected the proposal to combine those 5 separate programs into a single block grant. And that's huge because right now, when HUD sends this money to the states, it's earmarked for different things. You're going to spend this much money on housing for seniors. You're going to spend this much money on housing for disabilities. You're going to spend this much money on Section 8 vouchers, so on and so forth. And by dissolving all of that and putting it into a single block grant, HUD would have basically been telling states, here's a chunk of money, use it for housing or whatever, and then each state would have to make determinations about how that money would be used. So by rejecting that proposal and continuing those 5 programs, it should make sure that seniors, people with disabilities, things like that, are going to be able to access the same services that they are accustomed to. So with all of that in mind, though, it is important to remember that this is just one step in the process. I believe that further changes could be made at the committee level when it goes before the House and so on and so forth. So this is not a final done deal. This is still just the next round of proposals, basically, right? Now, this bill did include a $773 million decrease for the voucher program overall, and that is going to hit hard. That means less families are going to get vouchers, and that's not good. That being said, it does include level funding for voucher renewals, which on the surface sounds like a good thing that they're not cutting that. But the National Low Income Housing Coalition did note that flat funding is not sufficient to renew all existing contracts because of rent increases and various things that make them more expensive over time. So even level funding may result in some cuts. The House draft also does not include any additional funding to continue the emergency housing voucher program, but it does allow tenant protection vouchers to be used as those EHVs. So if you're currently receiving voucher help through the emergency housing voucher program, in theory, your voucher could be at risk by this change if it is continued as is. So please do be aware of that. I feel like the earlier you know about these changes, hopefully the more proactive you can be in finding solutions. I know that that's hard when housing is so debilitatingly expensive, but I do want you to be aware of what's being considered. The House draft also does not follow the White House's request to consolidate the HAG grants and the HOPWA grants into the ESG program. Instead, they continue funding for those separately. It also does include a provision to cut HUD staff by 26% as requested, and it does eliminate the funding for home, which also creates more affordable housing. So there's, compromises in here, right? Now, here's the thing about those time limits. I didn't see anything in there that specifically was like, oh, yeah, we're doing 2-year time limits. But 2 of the most well known organizations that review these things, and of course, they're staffed by people way more qualified than I am, right? They've got lawyers and people there that work for them, and I'm just a researcher. But I really put a lot of trust in these 2 organizations when they're analyzing these things. And the National Low Income Housing Coalition says the House draft bill includes problematic policy proposals, including a proposal that would provide HUD with broad flexibility to allow public housing authorities to waive or create alternatives to key statutory requirements, which could allow for harmful work requirements and time limits. So it looks like there's going to be a lot more flexibility there for your local PHA to decide what rules they want to put on those voucher programs. Now, CBPP, that's the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities, says the appropriations bill would also give HUD sweeping authority to allow state and local agencies to change the amount of rent voucher holders and public housing residents are required to pay, with no limit on how much families could be charged. This would allow agencies not only to sharply raise rents, but also to impose time limits on assistance, since they could adopt a policy raising a family's rent after 2 years by so much that the family would no longer receive any help to afford housing. So there are loopholes in this current version of the bill that could result in those 2-year time limits that are being proposed. That being said, I know a lot of people who follow this channel are either over the age of 60 or you have a disability or what have you. To my understanding, those time limits are intended to apply only to able-bodied adults. I don't know if it's with or without dependents, but I do know that they were talking about exempting elderly and disabled people from those time limits. So hopefully that brings you some measure of comfort. I know that CBPP is still estimating that up to 3 million people could be losing their housing as a result of those time limit changes. So I'm not trying to underestimate the impact of this or say that it's not going to be bad in any way. I know that it's still going to be catastrophic if that happens. But I wanted you to be aware of kind of the terms that would apply to that as we see this move forward. Outside of that, we're still seeing pushes in other ways to bring about those time limits, those work requirements, those restrictions that would drastically cut down on the amount of people who are eligible for help. So, CBPP reports that HUD is reportedly planning to propose a regulation allowing or requiring housing agencies and subsidized owners to impose rental assistance time limits and policies that take rental assistance away from people who cannot meet rigid work requirements. So that's coming from CBPP. And you can see that article on their website. It's a very fascinating read. They tend to get very technical about things, but there's a lot of good information in there. And like I said, they are estimating that those 3 million people could lose their housing due to these time limits, and about half of those are children. In addition to that, the housing bill that we were talking about also includes a 67% cut to HUD's fair housing activities, which includes enforcement for housing discrimination rules, things like that. So that could make it even harder to retain housing in some cases, depending on what's going on. But the good news is, right, like I said, there are still many, many steps between where we are now and where this proposal has to get to become official. So at this point, you can still reach out to your elected lawmakers and let them know how you feel about these changes. You can go to congress.gov. If you find the little box in the sidebar that says contact your member, you can enter your address, click the little search button there, and it will give you the mailing address, email address, phone number, everything you need to reach out to your elected lawmakers and share your story and hopefully influence the way that they're going to vote on this if and when it eventually comes before them for consideration. That being said, it really feels like this administration isn't just putting all of their eggs in one basket, right? They're kind of attacking these things from multiple different angles. So, outside of that bill that is currently in the committee, there are other measures being taken to affect Section 8 and housing assistance as well. So I want to go over some of those with you really quickly. The Senate Banking Committee, which is a different committee than the one we already discussed, is supposed to begin considering the Renewing Opportunity in the American Dream to Housing Act this month. This would expand the moving to work demonstration waiver to cover most or all public housing authorities. Right now, I think it only applies to 1 or 200 of them. But the moving to work waiver allows the participating agencies to move money away from the voucher program to other things and impose time limits, work requirements, rent increases, all sorts of different things. So this is basically another approach to accomplish the same ends, right? I mean, if you have officials on the Senate Banking Committee, you can reach out to them. It's another thing you can reach out to your lawmakers about. Just know that it's a completely separate act than the one that we were just discussing a few minutes ago. And beyond that, there's a separate administration proposal that would put time limits on rental assistance received through homeless assistance programs. That one in particular would end continuums of care programs, which provide permanent supportive housing for people with disabilities who have experienced homelessness in the past. And there's other things that that one would do too, but that continuum of care program would definitely be at risk by that proposal that has been made. With that, I just want to give a quick shout out to our sponsor today, Injury Claims. They have all sorts of different open cases available, and if you're eligible for one of them, you may be able to get significant financial compensation. You can go to the link you see on screen, browse through their list of open cases. If you're interested in one, just click join now, answer the quick survey, and they can connect you with someone who can help. So be sure to go check that out, and I will see you again soon for more ways that you can save money and get free stuff.